Folks, our first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant, is now available for you to learn at your own pace for just €50, and it comes with a certificate upon completion. Go to mapitforward.coffee/workshops or click the link in the show notes for more details. Support this podcast by supporting our sponsors. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and joining me for episode 3 of our 5-part series is Lena Parker, my twin sister, who is talking to us about energy security and the coffee industry. She's talking about energy security. I'm bringing the coffee industry part to the conversation. Our worlds are colliding for the first time. And so in this episode, well, let me frame it this way. In the first episode, we kind of talked about why we need to discuss this issue. And this is something that the coffee industry is not really aware of. They're not paying as much attention as we really need to, because as you mentioned, this is really quite a time-sensitive issue across every industry. Right, Lena?
Yeah.
Okay. And then in the second episode of this series, we started defining some terms that were necessary to understand how to dig deep into how we need to start framing the discussion if we want to get some real insight into it. One of those terms was electrification. Now, that's what I want to discuss in this episode, like the nitty-gritty of electrification. So to frame the discussion from the coffee supply chain perspective, and again, shout out to the human who helped me prepare for this and helped me understand some of the particular things that I wouldn't know about this. You know who you are, but the expertise of understanding the complexity of coffee as a complex agricultural product, and how this subject really relates to that is from this perspective. If you can imagine for a second, Lena, the production of coffee in Ethiopia, right, versus the production of coffee in Brazil. So Brazil is the number one producing country of coffee in the world, and the landscape of the way that coffee is grown is very different to the landscape in Ethiopia, and very different to the landscape in Colombia. Like, it's all very different, right? They have different kind of weather and different altitudes and all that kind of stuff. So in a country like Ethiopia, coffee is produced in communities. So there's a lot more manual labor that's involved in that. Coffee is picked by hand the majority of time, and the processing is using perhaps mechanization, but a lot less dependency on mechanization than in a country like Brazil. Now, in a country like Brazil, what you've got is the terrain that coffee is grown on and the kinds of coffee that are grown there. Because it's more in the commercial market, what happens is having to pay attention to the ripeness of cherries on the tree isn't as specialized as it is in the specialty coffee industry. So because all this commercial coffee is grown in Brazil, what they do is they have these kind of big ag equipment that goes in and just strips the trees of their cherries, regardless of the difference of ripeness on there. So here we have an example of a combustion engine that is using diesel, or perhaps there's a hybrid model with newer technology that is necessary in order for the supply of coffee to be sustainable. There's that word again that we defined in the last episode. But in order for us to keep up with the production demand of that coffee, we have high dependency on mechanization, which is dependent on diesel or other kinds of fuels. And then you take combustion again into the roastery, and you have a combustion situation that's required to heat an element in order to heat up a roasting drum so that it can do the other hybrid model, which is powered by electricity, which sure we can grab from solar, provided the conditions are right, but that doesn't work in countries that experience an extraordinary amount of nighttime in the winter months across Europe predominantly, and parts of the Northern Hemisphere. So Here we have a challenge whereby the infrastructure, the roasting machines, like these business models are run on razor thin margins. If we're going to look at something like electrification, how does an industry start framing this conversation so that it becomes approachable?
It's a great question. And the coffee industry isn't unique here. If you take mining, for example, and Australia is very heavy in mining, a lot of the Fortescue Metals is a great example where they have
Fortescue Metals
is a iron ore mining company in Australia, publicly listed organisation. So all the information that I'm talking about is you can Google it. Why they're a great example is that they have electrified their fleet. They're very, very, very heavy fleet. So I mean big ass assets here. And in doing that, they've also made them autonomous, which is just another interesting aspect, right? And so they have had to. They are bleeding edge in terms of. Not so much. Well, they are bleeding edge, but also they are an organisation that is actively decided to put investment into how they electrify their vehicles through batteries, through hydrogen, through all of that kind of stuff. And another aspect to remember is that their industry is very heavy in emissions. And so they have to find ways to actually decarbonize their processes really quickly. And that was a good place to start. So it's not a unique, nothing of what we're talking about. I would be very surprised if there was a single process within the coffee supply chain that is unique to the coffee supply chain. The other thing to factor in, right? Let's say, so every one of your, each of the businesses that exist within the coffee industry are somewhere, right? And that somewhere is a country that has to, if they haven't today, will need to commit to net zero by a certain time. But most countries have committed to net zero by 2050. So let's look at the investment cycles, right? These massive roasters or what did you call them, pickers?
Yeah. Or, coffee
let's
pickers.
say that they've got a useful life of 15 years. Is that about right?
I have
10.
Well, for a roasting machine, you're looking at more like probably 10 years, but for these picking machines, yeah.
So let's say 10 years. That means that if you make a decision to buy a roasting machine in 2025, right? You are carrying the emissions that roaster has for your country for the next 10 years.
Okay.
So if you're in Australia and we're a country that has committed to a 43% reduction by 2030, the investment decisions that you're taking now are not going to help Australia get to that. If you're buying a non-electric asset, you're going to continue to be emitting well past 2030.
So now it's a legislative issue. So now countries
there's a lot of this going on. So if you think about, there are car manufacturers now that are saying beyond 2035, we're not going to be making combustion engines.
So they're aligning themselves with legislation.
Right. So you get organisations who are looking at how do they electrify their light vehicles and their fleet, because they know that this is the way that things are going. And typically it's a 5-year lease period that organisations are taking, and they're needing to reduce their own emissions. And so, the mega roasters in the world who are doing a lot of the non-specialty, forgive me, I don't know the terms, but whatever the opposite of specialty is, I'll just call it non-specialty. Commercial. So these really massive commercial quantities that are being done, those organisations are have a corporate social responsibility to commit to the sustainable objectives under the emissions under the sustainable objectives. If they continue to buy, and this is an easy way, not an easy way, but it is low-hanging fruit for them to actually electrify these assets so that they're not tipping pollutants into the air. Now, if they do it for 10 years and then they do it for another 10-year cycle, then you're well and truly on your way to 2050 where they'll continue to do it. And people within those communities, we're seeing it every single day. The clients that I work with, the financiers that we work with that are financing organizations, and investors who are buying shares are actually looking buying shares in companies are actually looking at what the sustainability report and sustainability strategy, which part of that is emissions, what they're doing to ensure that they're reducing their emissions and being a socially responsible organization. Because no one, not no one, that's a blanket statement, but most people are unlikely to if not now, definitely into the future, they will be unlikely to invest in someone who is heavy emitter. It's just, the conversation has gone well past that. And there are frameworks, and they're called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions that are used to measure how people are polluting. And, when you think of conferences like COP, right? Mm-hmm. COP exists to broker the deals at a global level in order to bring down these emissions. Mm. And so when you have these massive commercial scale coffee organizations that will be working through this, they will have to participate. If they're not participating now in developing strategies to reduce their emissions, they will get there very soon, I imagine.
In the next episode, because now we're at the point where this is going to start to become a fiscal issue. This is going to become something that, and why I raise this now is we are in a very, very challenging time economically in the coffee industry, with inflation pushing razor thin margins, even they're just evaporating. And what you're suggesting and what you've spoken about is this will make the production of coffee more expensive.
I wouldn't necessarily say that, because, and I started off, I think one of the first things that I said in the first episode was, we look at ways to not only shore up energy supply, which can make it more expensive through investment, but it's how to be more efficient as well. So if you can bring down overall demand,
right,
then you can absorb a lot of that investment.
Okay. In the next episode, we're going to talk a lot around that subject, in that relationship between the transition. Let's put it this way. We're going to talk about energy transition and what that means for the coffee industry. Okay?
Okay.
Get ready, Lena. Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.